Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 5, about the executive branch, and it's Lesson 10, about electoral strategy. In this lesson, you'll learn what would happen if there was no winner of the Electoral College. You'll also learn about what if the popular vote and the Electoral College differ in the winners that they choose. You'll learn about safe states and swing states, and about the electoral strategy that presidential candidates generally follow. In previous lesson, you learned about the Electoral College, how the president is chosen by electors, who are selected by state legislatures, who get input from voters in the state about who they should be selecting as electors. You also learned how a candidate wins the Electoral College. In the Constitution, it says that the candidate who gets a majority of the whole number of electors appointed becomes the president. Well, with 538 electors, that means the person who gets 270 electoral votes becomes president. Now, with a reminder of those basic things that you learned in a previous lesson, let's consider a question. What if no candidate receives a majority of the electoral votes? It's actually happened in American history. The first time was in the election of 1800. The two main combatants in that election were John Adams, the sitting president, who was a member of the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the leader of the Republican Party, as it was known at the time, which, just as an interesting aside, is not the same Republican Party we have today. But when the votes were counted up from the Electoral College, after they were cast in the election of 1800, the real battle remained not between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but between Thomas Jefferson and a man named Aaron Burr. The reason for this was because the rules at the time in the Constitution gave each elector 2 votes to cast for president. And because Thomas Jefferson had helped organize a political party, when the electors were elected as members of that political party, they were instructed to cast their first vote for Thomas Jefferson and their second vote for his running mate, Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be the vice president. The reason for this was because, again, as the Constitution was at that time, it's since been amended and changed. Whoever got the second most votes in the Electoral College became the vice president. So, now notice this. If every single member of their political party who is made an elector casts 1 vote for Thomas Jefferson and 1 vote for Aaron Burr, then in the end, they end up tied in the Electoral College, which is what happened. This was quite a surprise for them. They hadn't anticipated this happening. They hadn't thought it through. And they hadn't particularly thought through that when that happened, that Aaron Burr might decide that he has a chance to not just be the vice president, but become the president of the United States instead. Another time in which this happened was the election of 1824. When I say this happened, I mean that the Electoral College failed to give a majority of its votes to a single candidate. In the election of 1824, there were 4 major candidates running for the presidency. You can see them listed here. When the electoral votes were counted, Andrew Jackson had 99, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who was in the 1800 election contest mentioned a moment ago. John Quincy Adams had 84 electoral votes, William Crawford had 41, and Henry Clay had 37. None of them had a majority. So, what happens in these 2 situations that actually happen in history, where there is no majority in the Electoral College? Well, what the Constitution says would happen in a situation like that is that the House of Representatives would choose the president, with each state casting a single vote. So, for example, the representatives from California in our modern system, California wasn't a state yet when these elections happened, but today, if we ended up in this situation, all the 53 representatives from California would have to get together and decide how to cast their single vote from California, while the 14 representatives from Georgia would have to get together and decide how to cast their one vote from the state of Georgia, and the single representative from the state of Wyoming to get to decide how to cast his vote any way he wanted. Okay, so the different delegations in the House of Representatives from the various states would get together and cast their votes, and then whichever candidate got a majority of those votes would then become President of the United States. The Constitution then says that the Senate would choose the Vice President of the United States. So how did these rules then play out in those two elections, the election of 1800 and the election of 1824, when the Electoral College failed to reach a majority and elect someone as president? In the election of 1800, the House of Representatives ended up choosing Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States. This was upsetting for Aaron Burr. He was particularly upset because Alexander Hamilton was instrumental in Thomas Jefferson winning by convincing some of his friends in the House of Representatives to support Jefferson. This led to the feud between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton that eventually ended with Aaron Burr shooting Alexander Hamilton in a duel. In the election of 1824, when the House of Representatives had a chance to decide that election, they ended up choosing John Quincy Adams as the president. This upset Andrew Jackson greatly, since he had won the most electoral votes. And being very upset about it, he then set about building a great political following to then defeat John Quincy Adams 4 years later. Now let me remind you of another aspect of the Electoral College that you learned about in a previous lesson. And that's that each state legislature, when it chooses the electors, can do it as they see fit. They're the ones in charge of deciding. And they've all decided, with a couple of little minor exceptions I said not to worry about, because in practice they pretty much always turn out winner takes all. Anyway, all the states have decided to assign their electors through a winner takes all basis. Well, this has some potentially drastic consequences. Look at this list of states here with their electors listed beside them. California is the state with the most electors, 55. Texas the next most with 38. New York and Florida with 29, etc. Well, imagine that there's a candidate that wins California just barely, wins Texas just barely, wins New York just barely, etc., through here, and ends up winning all these 11 states. That candidate would earn 270 electoral votes. Now let's further imagine that they did this, winning all these 11 states just barely, without winning a single vote in the other 39 states. We would have a situation where a candidate could get elected president by only winning 11 states, and still, through that process, get 270 electoral votes. What this means then is that it's possible that we could have a candidate receive the most electoral votes while not receiving the most popular votes, or vice versa. In other words, one person could get the most votes from the people of the country, but not get enough electoral votes to win. And that's actually happened a few times in American history too. In the election of 1876, Samuel Tilden got the most popular votes, but Rutherford Hayes got the most electoral votes. In the election of 1888, Grover Cleveland got the most popular votes, but Benjamin Harrison got the most electoral votes. And in the election of 2000, Al Gore got the most popular votes, but George W. Bush got the most electoral votes. So who wins? Well, the candidate who receives a majority in the Electoral College is elected president, period, whether he gets the most popular votes or not. In fact, the popular votes are entirely irrelevant to this question. Now, some people may wonder about that, though. Matter of fact, you may hear, when these kind of things are discussed, some people say, that's not fair. One candidate got the most votes from the people. That candidate should be President of the United States, no matter what the Electoral College says. But if you really wonder if this is fair for the person who wins the Electoral College but doesn't win the popular vote becoming president, the answer is yes, it is clearly fair. But why? It's clearly fair because neither candidate is even trying to win the popular vote. Consider that as they're running for president, they are entirely aware that the way to get elected president is to win the most Electoral College votes. As a matter of fact, not just the most, but win a majority of Electoral College votes. And they're aware that that is the only way to get elected president without going to the House of Representatives. You don't get elected president by winning the most popular votes. They're aware of this. So as they campaign, they're not trying to win the most popular votes. They're only trying to win the most electoral votes. Let me use an analogy from sports to illustrate what's really going on here. Here are the scores from the 2002 World Series. Now, if you look at this, and I ask you who won the World Series, the Giants or the Angels, if you go all the way down to the bottom and look at the total numbers of runs scored in the World Series, the Giants scored more runs than the Angels. But that doesn't mean the Giants won the World Series. Instead, if you look at the individual scores of the games, you'll see that the Angels won 4 games and the Giants won only 3. So the Angels won the World Series 4-3. That's what both teams were trying to do. They were trying to win the most games, and that's what the Angels succeeded in doing. Neither team was trying to score the most total runs in the World Series. Matter of fact, if that's what they were trying to do, these games would have actually been played differently. For example, if a team is ahead and they go into the 9th inning and they're the home team, they don't even bother to bat because they've already got more runs and the other team doesn't get to bat again, they've won the game. But what if the teams were trying to score the most total runs in the entire series? Then even a home team ahead in the bottom of the 9th would actually go to bat and try to score more runs. But the fact that they didn't do that, because those aren't the rules, then leads us to the conclusion that we don't know how many runs they would have scored then if they were actually trying to score the most runs total in the series. In other words, neither of them were trying to do what's listed on the bottom line. It's an accident that the Giants ended up with more. No, they were trying to win the most games. Perhaps an analogy from a different sport would be even better. If you follow football, then let me ask, who wins a game? The team that gains the most yards or the team that scores the most points? Well, the obvious answer is the team that scores the most points. But is that fair that they win just by scoring more points, even if they didn't gain more yards? Well, of course it is, because that's the rules of the game. And that's what they're trying to do. If they were trying to gain more yards, they would behave completely differently in the game. For example, they'd never punt. They'd never kick field goals, things like that, because they wouldn't be worried about the score. Instead, they'd be worried about the yards. Well, this is all comparable to presidential candidates. Neither of them's trying to win the popular vote. They're only trying to win electoral votes. So we don't know what the popular vote would have been if they'd actually been trying to do it. So to say that, for example, in 2000, Al Gore should have been president because he got more votes is actually a pretty absurd thing to say. He wasn't even trying to get more popular votes. So we'd have no idea which one of them would have gotten more if that's what they were actually trying to do. So with both candidates trying to get electoral votes, then that's what dictates their campaign strategy. Not trying to get popular votes, but trying to get electoral votes. Now, to see where this might lead them then as they hunt for popular votes, one of the things to consider is how many electoral votes each state has. So if you look at this map, you'll see, hey, California's got the most electoral votes, and then Texas has the next most. You might jump to the conclusion then that if the candidates are hunting electoral votes, they'll go to the states with the most electoral votes to try to win them. And they'll stay away from states that have small number of electoral votes, like, for example, New Hampshire with only 4, or Iowa with only 6. But the truth is that that's not how things work. And the reason is because of a concept called a safe state. A safe state is a state that overwhelmingly supports one political party or the other. California is a good example of this. California is an overwhelmingly Democratic state. And because of that, we know in every presidential election, the voters there are overwhelmingly going to vote for the Democrat, thus recommending to the state legislature to appoint the slate of electors who are pledged to support that Democrat. And those are the electors that will then participate in the Electoral College. We know that well ahead of time. We don't even need to hold a big election there to know that California is going to vote for the Democrat. It is a safe seat. So even though it has 55 electoral votes, neither candidate's going to bother to go campaign there. The Democrat's not going to bother to campaign there because he or she knows that it's already a victory for them. The Republican's not going to bother to campaign there, knowing that it's already a loss. They're going to spend their time and resources elsewhere. So safe states are never visited, regardless of how many electoral votes they have. During the general election, neither candidate bothers trying to campaign in states that are safe for one candidate or the other. Instead, they spend their time campaigning in what are called swing states. These are states that either candidate can potentially win. Here's a map of the states, the swing states, or what we can also call battleground states in 2016. They're the gray states on this map. These are the states that could go one way or the other, either for Hillary Clinton or for Donald Trump. The states already marked in blue are ones that we know are going to vote for Hillary Clinton, even before the election happens. The ones marked in red are the ones that we can know are going to vote for Donald Trump, even before the election happens. And if you total those up, then that means going into Election Day, Hillary Clinton already has 227 electoral votes in her back pocket, and Donald Trump already has 191. What's going to decide the election is which candidate these states in gray decide to support. And if whichever candidate wins enough of them to get over that 270 vote threshold is the one that then wins the election. So with that in mind, where do these candidates campaign at then? Well, first of all, we know, as I said a few moments ago, they are not going to campaign in the safe states at all. Instead, they'll spend the entire general election campaign campaigning only in the swing states and battleground states. That's all they'll do. Just jump around from Florida to Ohio to Pennsylvania to Nevada, etc., those states marked in gray. Because those are the states where they actually might be able to change things and get some votes that they otherwise wouldn't. While the safe states, there's no hope there for the challenger. It's guaranteed for the one that's the party favorite. There's no reason to even bother to campaign there. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What if there's no electoral college winner? Is there a revote held? Or does the candidate with the most popular votes win? Or does the House pick the winner? Or does the Senate pick the winner? The House of Representatives picks the winner if there is no winner in the Electoral College. Well, if the popular vote winner does not win the Electoral College, does the popular vote winner then win the election? Or does the Electoral College winner win the election? Or does the House choose the winner? Or is there a revote? The Electoral College decides the winner. Unless the Electoral College can't reach a majority, the Electoral College is how the election is decided, regardless of the popular vote. What is a swing state? Is it a state that either candidate may win? Or is it a state where one party always wins? Or does a different party win there from election to election? Or are polls not even being taken in that state? A swing state, or in other words, a battleground state, is a state where either candidate can win. So it can go either way, and it's called a battleground state because that's where the candidates go to battle for the electoral votes. So that then leads to the question I kind of just answered by that explanation of the previous one, and that is, where do the candidates usually campaign? Is it in the most populous states like California and Texas? Or is it states with the most electoral votes like California and Texas? Or is it the battleground states, in other words, the swing states, or is it their home states? Well, by this point, it should be obvious to you. The candidates campaign in the battleground states. That does it for this lesson. The next lesson from Unit 5 will be Lesson 11 about choosing candidates.